Alone in the Dark is a 2008 title developed by Eden Games, a dev team mostly known for their take on the Test Drive IP, and published by Atari. It is a soft reboot of the Alone in the Dark series, which was the first in the early 90s to combine pre-rendered backgrounds with polygonal graphics, before the Resident Evil games, and is usually considered to be the progenitor of the survival horror genre. The 2008 entry stars as the protagonist the very same Edward Carnby that the player controlled in the first game. Indeed, while the game is set almost a century after the events that took place in the first Alone in the Dark, it belongs to the same continuity, and the fact that Edward has not aged at all has been woven into the narrative of the game. In the 100 years or so that separate the settings of the two games, Edward has been protecting the Lucifer Stone, an artifact that grants its owner the gift of immortality. However, the owner of the stone is also subjected to the influence of Lucifer himself, for which reason Edward has decided to hide himself and live a solitary life. Unfortunately for him and the rest of the world, he is found and experimented upon by a group of people bent on breaking the bond between him and the stone to set the spirit of Lucifer free. The experiment is successful, and as a result, Edward is no longer under Lucifer's influence. At the same time, though, when Edward wakes up from the experiment, he realizes that he has no recollection of his past, and what is worse, the power of Lucifer, now freed from the stone, has been unleashed on New York, where the game takes place. While the story is not the game's strongest suit, and there are no memorable characters to speak of, with the possible exception of Edward himself, if you happen to be a fan of the older titles, it is decent enough to keep the player's attention for the 6 to 8 hours it'll take them to finish the game. The presentation, though, is excellent, especially the soundtrack. Composed by Olivier Derivière, it is one of the most beautiful soundtracks I've ever listened to, and I'm including movie soundtracks. There would be no point in trying to make it justice by lavishing it with praise when you can listen to it yourself on YouTube. I highly recommend that you do so, as it is truly one of the best soundtracks I've ever listened to, and I'm sure it won't fail to make you excited about playing the game. As for the graphics, I find that they have aged well, with some highs, such as the detailed character textures and the lightning, and some lows, like the stiff animation and the macro stutters that affect the PC port. What emerges very distinctly and also quite potently from the combination of sound and visual is a very cinematic approach to storytelling, through cutscenes and heavily scripted gameplay moments that I think has stood the test of time. The gameplay is the real star of the show. Just like the original Alone in the Dark, the 2008 game is a survival horror in which resources are relatively scarce and the inventory must be managed carefully to not run out of space. The novelty comes from the heavy emphasis on crafting, which allows to create all sorts of tools that can be used either to dispatch enemies whose only weakness is fire or to solve puzzles. As an example, a plastic bottle containing alcohol can be used as a bomb if you shoot it after you have thrown it in the air. Combine it with tape and you have transformed it into a sticky bomb. If the bottle is made of glass though, even more options open up. For example, you can combine it with a tissue to craft a Molotov that you can set on fire with your lighter. The crafting system alone, given the great variety of items that you can create, and the relative ample selection of puzzles and combat encounters that require you to do so, would be enough to warrant the attention of any fan of the genre. Fortunately, there's more than that. For instance, Alone in the Dark features a robust physics system that accounts for not only how objects and bodies react to gravity, but also how the natural elements can affect the environment. Naturally, fire plays a very important role, as it is basically the only means through which you can take care of the enemies. Objects made of wood, including locked doors that you need to get through, catch fire realistically. You can put out the flames that obstruct your path by using bottles of water or fire extinguishers, but also erect literal firewalls to keep the enemies at bay by emptying your reserves of alcohol on the floor and setting them ablaze. Other elements worthy of mention are the melee weapons that you can swing by making half circles with the right analog stick, the ability to fast forward to later parts of the game, even if you have not completed the story yet, and a semi-open world structure that serves as connecting tissue for the more linear story-driven levels. Alone in the Dark is not without problems, most notably a rather convoluted control scheme that requires you to switch from first to third person depending on which action you want to execute. Eventually you'll get the hang of it, and admittedly, the number of things that you can do in the game is so high that it is hard to imagine a more elegant system. However, it cannot be denied that the experience of playing as Edward is never as smooth as one would hope for. The game is also rather short, but the spectacular set pieces, most notably the escape from the crumbling skyscraper at the beginning of the game, combined with the fast forward feature that allows the player to jump from one set piece to the next, lend themselves to multiple playthroughs. Overall, Alone in the Dark is a very ambitious title that doesn't necessarily succeed in everything it tries to accomplish. It's a clear case of the whole being much more than the sum of the parts. The single components like the wonky driving physics or the awkward combat system do not impress when scrutinized in isolation. However, the designers were able to come up with scenarios that force the player to integrate the multiple gameplay options at their disposal, thus incentivizing experimentation and lateral thinking. It's a game that decides to travel off the beaten path, for which reason I was more than willing to overlook its deficiencies and technical shortcomings. Nowadays it can be found for very cheap, and I recommend that you give it a try.